Welcome everybody to TechCraft. This is Rob, and in this video, I'll run you through the apps, hardware, and workflow I use when shooting photographs on the iPhone. Let's go. So I really enjoy taking photographs both as a hobby and to mix in with the video footage here on the channel. Now, for most of my planned shooting, I use my Canon EOS R, then I edit those photographs on the iPad, and I will be covering the workflow I use for that in the next part of this series. But I really wanted to take some time today just to dive into the workflow I use for iPhone only shooting and editing. Let's dive straight in and take a look at the hardware that I'm using. So I'm using the iPhone X to shoot on. This is about 2 years old now, and it's still going really strong and still takes some fantastic photographs. And a lot of the photographs I take on the iPhone are just the iPhone X with nothing else. However, if I know I'm going to be doing a lot of photographs, then I will take with me my Moment 18mm lens. So I really love the 18mm lens for the iPhone because I use that device mostly for kind of street and architecture photography when I'm visiting new cities. And the 18mm just gives me that extra wide angle to really take in the scenery in the city. What I think is great about the Moment lenses is how they fit to the iPhone. So rather than just kind of like hanging loosely on top of the camera, you get a special case, and the case fixes the lens in place directly over the iPhone camera. If you have a double camera iPhone like I have, then your case has 2 slots and you can switch the lens between the different slots to cover either the normal zoom or the telephoto zoom camera. I'm so taken by these lenses that I've actually just ordered the macro lens as well, and I'm holding off on upgrading to the iPhone 11 until I can get the case for that phone that will take these lenses. And then the final piece of kit I carry with me is this small Joby GorillaPod with the smartphone attachment. Even in the iPhone X, the image stabilization is pretty good, but I do like to have the tripod with me just for those extra long exposures or those low light scenarios where I want that extra steadiness that I just can't get out of my hands. So let's talk about camera apps. I think the standard iPhone camera app is still really good, and I do find myself reaching for it when I want to take a quick snap. However, there are camera apps on the App Store that I think are better and give you far more control over your photographs. For a short while, I was using the Moment camera app, and it is a really nice app. However, it misses out on portrait mode, which meant I was switching back to the standard app quite frequently. And then more recently, I've just found myself using Halide, which has everything I need directly in one app. Let's take the phone outside and have a look. So in fully manual mode, the Halide app works just like the standard camera app. You can touch and drag on the screen to control exposure, and you have a shutter button at the bottom. If you tap the small yellow triangle, you go into manual mode. Here you can control the white balance, so you maybe choose cloudy or daylight or tungsten, whatever's right for your lighting scenario. You can control the ISO, so if you want to increase the brightness, you can do that. Notice in the top right corner, you're now controlling shutter speed rather than necessarily just the exposure compensation, but again, touch and drag on the screen to control that. Hit the yellow AF, you switch out of autofocus into manual focus, and you can slide side to side. But it works much better if you enable focus peaking with the little icon on the lower left there, and that kind of shows these green focus peaking lines. You can have access to both cameras, so the 1x and 2x zoom here on the iPhone X. In the top right corner, you'll see that I've got the histogram up here, and I can turn that on and off as I need. Just above the yellow triangle icon, you'll see there's an up arrow. Hitting that brings up the settings menu. This is particularly important. In here, I can enable the grid for shooting. I can control the timer function. I can enable flash if I desire. But more importantly, in here, I can switch on RAW shooting mode. By default, the camera is recording images in HEIC format, but if you enable RAW, it takes raw DNG files. One of the coolest features of the Halide app is how it handles the multi-depth camera. So obviously in the standard app, you have portrait mode, but here you have a bit more control over that. So if you hit the depth button, it brings up the multi-depth camera. You can switch on the depth map to visualize the levels that the camera is seeing. You can take a photograph in this cool radar mode, which I really like, or you can enable something that's a bit more similar to the standard portrait mode. Now, you might see that this isn't quite as accurate in the preview as the standard app is, but the resulting photographs are perfectly fine. I really like the depth map functionality here. It's a good way of visualizing what the camera is seeing. And one of the things that's really cool about Halide is that depth map is stored alongside the photographs. So if you want to revisit it later on, you absolutely can do. So that's taking photographs. Now let's take a look at editing them. And you can definitely do a lot better than the standard editing features in the Photos app. There are tons of options. For a little while, I was using Lightroom from Adobe CC. The free version is pretty good, and if you have a Creative Cloud account, you may like the fact that the photos you edit sync straight to Lightroom on your desktop. But if you're not in that ecosystem, or if you want something that may be a little bit more iOS friendly, then I can really recommend the Darkroom app. Let's take a look at that right now. So here I am in Darkroom, and one of the things I really like about Darkroom is that you can open it up straight from in Halide on the photograph that you've just taken, or you can just browse through the Halide gallery and open up straight from there. But here we are in the actual Darkroom gallery, and we're just going to start by going into this shot here, which is a raw shot from Halide, and we'll do a full edit on it. We'll take it from left to right on the toolbar here at the bottom, and we'll start with this, which is the crop tool. And quite handy, you can choose what grid that you want. So I've got a 3x3 here. You can choose a particular aspect ratio, and we'll choose 1x1 square, which is the aspect ratio you need for Instagram. And then we'll just click done. Once we've positioned that, maybe get a little bit more of that fence in there, click done. Now, this has been shot in RAW, so it's quite dark, it's quite flat, and we can fix that up by coming into the light. But before we do that, let me just show you all of these kind of like cool inbuilt filters. If you pay for the full Darkroom pack, you get access to all of these cool filters, but I'm not going to use those. We're going to edit manually. And I'll start by going into the sliders and raising the exposure a little bit, maybe quite a bit, actually. That looks quite nice. And then I want to increase the contrast like that, or maybe just try and drop the highlights a little bit and raise the shadows. Maybe drop the shadows. And we can kind of go through this whole process to see where we want to get to. It needs a bit more saturation. This is quite nice. I think the white balance is around about right. I'm going to just maybe increase the vignette to have a little bit of darkness to focus ourselves in. I can do split toning in the shadows and the highlights here. I will come back to that in a second. What I want to do is do a curves adjustment, maybe just increase the highlights a little bit and just decrease the shadows to kind of create that nice contrast. In the hue, saturation, and luminance tabs, I can really start to tweak this image now. So I think that the fence is a bit orange, so I'm going to take some of that orange out by reducing the saturation. I may even just increase the brightness to make it a little bit less harsh. And I think I'll do the same on the reds as well, just because there's some red in there and probably some yellow as well, so we'll do that. The green, I'd like it to look a bit more vivid, so I'm just going to tweak that towards the yellow spectrum and increase saturation, maybe increase the luminance. That's nice. These stones are looking a bit blue to me, so I'm just going to take the blue saturation down to get them a bit gray, and maybe just improve these purple tones for those flowers in the background there. That's quite nice. If I hold down now on the image, you can go back to what the original was, and you can see that the difference is quite remarkable. I have this last tab where I can create these kind of framing effects if I want to print this out, which is quite nice. I've not really used this, to be honest, because I don't really print a lot of these images out, but it's still quite nice if you want to, on the go, edit a shot for use in your home. What I want to do now, though, is go back to the split toning here at the bottom and just show you what that looks like. So let's clear that frame out, come back to split toning. What I think I'll do is maybe put some orange into these highlights. So I'm going to pick an orangey color and increase the amount of that like that. And then in the shadows, I'm going to put some, maybe a tealish color, kind of create that effect. It's very subtle there, but you can sort of mess around with that as you want. The key thing to notice here is I've got a full raw editing suite at my hand. What I want to show you though, and one of the things that I think is the killer features of Darkroom, is how you can edit photos that were taken with the depth camera that have a depth map attached to them. So let's see that now. So I'm back in Darkroom now, and I have an image we took earlier on, but this time it was taken in portrait mode, so it has a full depth map available to it. And I have all the normal controls, so if I want to mess around with kind of the exposure and stuff, I can do. But what I have at the top here is separate controls for the foreground and background. So if I bring up the background here and maybe reduce the brightness, you can see that the background brightness is changing. I can improve the saturation in the background, or I can reduce the saturation. I can change the blur in the background if I want. I can reduce the blur. I can do all these cool things. But what I can also do is change what is the background and what is treated as the foreground using these depth meters. So I'm going to hover over this little marker for the foreground here, and you can see the bits that are highlighted in red are the foreground. And I'm going to do the same for the background, which is the blue, and I'm going to try and bring that forward. And the closer together you have these, the kind of more, the sharper the line is between the foreground and the background. So that's quite a nice capture of what I wanted. And now if I mess with the blur, you'll see the background really blurs out as I increase the blur. But I can also pretty much get rid of the blur. This is something that I find to be quite incredible. Here I have the ability to basically change the depth of field after the fact in the editing application. This is why I have Darkroom as my favorite photo editor for the iPhone, because it marries just perfectly with the camera that's right there in the device. So Darkroom and Halide account for about 95% of the work I do on photographs on the iPhone. And of course, there are loads of apps like Visco and Snapseed that you can get that add loads of interesting filters to your images. But if you pay for Darkroom, you get the full pro package and you get all those filters included. The only other app that I use on a regular basis is Lens Distortions, which allows me to add like kind of interesting effects on top of my images before I put them on social media. So let's take a quick look at that. So here I am in the Lens Distortions app, and I have a photograph of my wife that I took on a recent trip to Cornwall. And what I want to do is just add something to it that just softens it out a little bit. I've already done a little bit of editing on this in Darkroom, and maybe what I'm going to do is add some kind of like shimmer effect to it. So if I come into these overlays and have a scout about, I can find shimmer, and then I can just tap on one of these filters and it adds it on top. Then I can maybe just rotate it a little bit and position it how I want it. It's kind of created this little just a sense of haze, I guess. Maybe there's a sense of like some dandelions or something like that floating in the air. And I can now control how I want this to fit. So I can make it brighter or maybe less bright. I'm going to have it like that. I can increase the contrast of that if I want to, or reduce the contrast. You kind of have full control over how the particle effect layers on top. It's very, very subtle, but these little filters can just finish off an image and really just add something special to it. So I find myself using this, 2 or 3 times a week when I take a shot that's just missing something. So as we've seen, there is a really powerful toolkit for taking photographs on the iPhone. If all you do is use the stock camera and the stock photos app with the stock lens, you can still get great photographs. But if you want to take it to the next level, a reasonably cheap investment in a lens, a few pounds spent on an app like Darkroom and Halide, and you can really take control over the powerful camera that's in the iPhone. And if you're an avid photographer, you really owe it to yourself to give these things a go. So I hope you found this video entertaining, and I hope you found it useful. In part 2 of this series, I'm going to dive into the workflow, the apps, and the hardware I use for photography with my iPad Pro. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, and don't just hit subscribe, but hit the bell as well so you don't miss out on that second part and on future content on the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.